At the start of the 1800s, New York had become one of America's largest cities. Its population had skyrocketed, and its position as a trade center secured its economic position. The opening of the Erie Canal in 1825 meant that New York was now able to trade more easily with the interior of the continent, taking its trade position to new heights. The influx of goods and people made New York a melting pot of activity with a diverse range of ethnic groups. These conditions created densely packed and highly populated areas in which the poorer residents resided. In these slums, gangs formed, using violence and thievery to survive in the bustling metropolis. Keep watching as we take a closer look at some of the real gangs of New York. A prominent hangout for the rougher elements of New York was an area known as Five Points. It was named Five Points since it was an intersection of three streets, Orange, Anthony, and Cross, and the intersection produced five corners, or points. The junction had been built on the site of an old pond that was drained due to pollution and hastily filled in. As the land was not stable, houses built there tended to lean or sag, which meant they were used by residents who couldn't afford to live anywhere else. The poverty in the area meant crime was rife, and gangs soon developed as a form of protection. One of the most famous and feared gangs of Five Points was the Dead Rabbits. It was made up of Irish immigrants and was mainly young men, although women may have been part of the gang as well. One woman who has been linked to the Dead Rabbits gang was Hellcat Maggie. However, most historians agree that she was probably a legend created by sensationalist 20th century writer Herbert Asbury, the author of the 1928 book The Gangs of New York, an informal history of the underworld. According to Asbury, Hellcat Maggie filed her teeth into points and wore razor-sharp brass fingernails when fighting her enemies. The Dead Rabbit Gang operated throughout the 1850s and survived by committing petty crime, burglary, and acts of violence. They often clashed with other gangs in the area, in particular the Bowery Boys, who took a dislike to the waves of Irish that were arriving in New York. The leader of the Dead Rabbits was John Morrissey, a bare-knuckle boxing champion who worked as an emigrant runner for Tammany Hall, helping Irish immigrants settle into life in New York, defending Tammany Hall supporters when they went to vote, and intimidating political rivals. In this role, he clashed with William Poole, aka Bill the Butcher of the Bowery Boys. In 1854, the Bowery Boys attacked the Dead Rabbits, who were defending the ballot boxes in favor of Tammany Hall mayoral candidate Fernando Wood. One skirmish in particular would gain national attention. On the evening of July 4, 1857, members of the Dead Rabbits, along with other street gangs from Five Points, raided a clubhouse occupied by the Bowery Boys. A huge brawl broke out and spilled into the street. The disorganized factions of police all thought the other forces should handle the situation, and the lack of intervention caused the situation to escalate. The next morning, the fighting resumed and continued off and on throughout the next day, despite attempts by the police to break it up. The brawl was finally brought to an end at around 9 p.m. on July 5th when the New York State Militia was brought in. The riot made it into national news, in which the Irish were typically portrayed as grotesque caricatures. In contrast, the American-born Bowery Boys were painted in a rather more sympathetic light. The Bowery Boys were perhaps more celebrated than any other of New York's gangs, but that doesn't necessarily mean that the people loved them. They were just as violent and underhanded as any other gang, although they felt that they were standing up for the rights of the American citizens against immigrants, in particular the Irish Catholics. One of their leaders, Bill the Butcher, is now part real, part myth, as stories of him became exaggerated and evolved into urban legend. A butcher by trade and a pugilist for fun, he was fiercely proud of being American, referring to himself as a native, with no hint of irony. Like the Dead Rabbits, the Bowery Boys were involved in politics and allied themselves with the so-called Know-Nothing nativist political movement. Prior to 1855, the Know-Nothings were officially called the Native American Party, despite their European heritage, changing the name to the American Party after 1855. Bill the Butcher died the same year the party changed its name, shot by a Welsh-American associate of Morrissey named Louis Baker. The Bowery Boys prided themselves on their appearance and standing, wearing elegant clothing and holding legitimate employment, including as volunteer firemen, when they weren't engaging in violent crime. Their name came from the street they frequented in Lower Manhattan, called Bowery. Thus, the neighborhood was called the Bowery, or just Bowery. As born and raised New Yorkers, the Bowery Boys were fiercely against the new waves of immigrants coming into New York City. They were heavily into politics and would intimidate voters into supporting a particular candidate in return for preferential treatment once the candidate got into office. Another famous face amongst the Bowery Boys was Michael Walsh. Walsh was more heavily into politics rather than the gang world and believed that the Bowery Boys could make respectable members of society. He opened political clubhouses in order to champion the rights of working-class laborers. He encouraged the Bowery Boys to try and become more cultured. The gang would often attend plays at the Bowery Theater, especially when they put on plays featuring the Bowery Boys themselves. Despite this show of civility, the Bowery Boys would often use the theater to drink, smoke, and cavort with prostitutes. When Walsh died in 1859, the Bowery Boys' culture of community-minded civility died with him. Other notable gangs included the 40 Thieves, a band of Irish thugs that met in the grocery store and dive bar of a woman named Rosanna Pierce. They were petty criminals led by Edward Coleman, who met his end in the hangman's noose after beating his wife to death. Supposedly, members of the gang had to fulfill quotas and were required to steal a certain amount each day in order to stay in the gang. In true Fagin-esque fashion, the gang had a youth group called the 40 Little Thieves, who served as lookouts and pickpockets. Outside of Manhattan, other groups of gangs operated, including the Daybreak Boys, who acted as river pilots, conducting their schemes in the East River in the 1840s and 50s. They took advantage of the city's booming shipping trade, usually striking at dawn. They were made up of young men whose leaders went by unflattering nicknames, such as Slobbery Jim and Cow-Legged Sam McCarthy. Unlike the brazen brawls of the Manhattan gangs, the Daybreak Boys preferred stealth, silently rowing up to anchored shipping vessels and sneaking aboard to steal as much as they could while remaining undetected. However, their covert operation did not exclude extreme acts of violence. According to legend, to become a Daybreak Boy, you would have to have killed at least one person, and watchmen that were in the wrong place at the wrong time could end up with a fractured skull or a slit throat. The dominance of the gangs came to an end in the 1860s, beginning with the draft riot of 1863. The riot was a result of conscription during the U.S. Civil War, as the draft targeted the poorer immigrant men in New York slums. On July 13th, the immigrant gangs began rioting against the draft. As the rivals of the Bowery Boys were engaged in the riot, the Bowery Boys gang stormed the Five Points and started looting shops, fighting locals, and tearing the place apart. The draft riot went on for 3 days, becoming the deadliest in American history. The main gangs were eventually disbanded, although not altogether stamped out. From the 1860s to the 1890s, a dominant street gang called the Wyos formed out of the remains of the Five Point gangs. One of their earlier leaders was Dandy John Dolan, who was arrested after he murdered a man during an attempted burglary. Another member of the gang, according to Herbert Asbury, was Piker Ryan, who listed services of thuggery alongside prices. Asbury states that on his arrest, the police found a piece of paper on which he had laid out his fees. Punching, $2. Both eyes blacked, $4. Nose and jaw broke, $10. Jacked out, $15. Ear chewed off, $15. Leg or arm broke, $19. Shot in leg, $25. Stab, $25. Doing the big job, $100 and up. Although they started as a loosely organized group of petty criminals, by the 1880s, their activities had evolved into counterfeiting, racketeering, and prostitution. As they profited from their illegal activities, the gang members began to open legitimate side businesses in order to pose as law-abiding citizens. During this time, they were led by Dan Driscoll and Dan Lyons, who took the gang to the peak of their power, but also to their ultimate downfall, starting when Driscoll began an internal feud when he dated and then accidentally shot Bridget Beasy Garrity, the girlfriend and prostitute of fellow gang member John Red McCarthy. During the 1890s, an Italian gangster named Paul Kelly united some of the old members of the Dead Rabbits and other gangs and formed the Five Points Gang. He enlisted around 1,500 members who engaged in violent turf wars with other gangs, including the Eastman Gang, a Jewish mob run by Edward Monk Eastman. Like the Dead Rabbits and the Bowery Boys, these two gangs constantly clashed, most famously in a huge gun battle that took place under the 2nd Avenue elevated train line. The members of the Five Points Gang took part in robberies, racketeering, and prostitution rings. They also worked for the Tammany Hall political machine, strong-arming and intimidating voters. Although their influence waned in the early 20th century, Some of the most famous mobsters of the 1920s came from their ranks, including Al Capone, Johnny Torrio, and Lucky Luciano. The Eastman Gang ran in Manhattan's Lower East Side, and in true New York gang fashion, they also teamed up with corrupt politicians, helping voter fraud. In return, their illegal activities were overlooked. The Eastmans offered murder-for-hire services, as well as running drug rings, protection rackets, and other illicit schemes. The gang's leader, Monk Eastman, has been referred to as the first real New York gangster, and his exploits have landed him in prison several times, including a spell at Sing Sing. By the time he was released, his gang had disbanded, and Eastman decided to enlist in the army under a false name. He was in his 40s at this point, and the men in his unit called him Pop. But during training, his obvious penchant for violence was noticed, and he was soon outed as the infamous gangster. Once deployed, Eastman became a war hero, and his reputation earned him a pardon from New York Governor Al Smith in May 1919. However, Eastman was born and raised in violence, and instead of going straight, he returned to mob life. He died in December 1920 when a corrupt prohibition agent shot him. How would you like to get a deeper understanding of history, impress your friends, and predict the future more accurately based on past events? If this sounds like something you might be into, then check out the brand new Captivating History Book Club by clicking the first link in the description. To learn more about the history of New York, check out our book, History of New York City, a captivating guide to historical events and facts you should know about New York City. It's available as an ebook, paperback, and audiobook. If you enjoyed the video, please hit the like button and subscribe for more videos like this.